Now, our first guest for today is clinical and forensic psychologist Nadya Wynchank. Nadya walks us through the current gender-based violence escalating across South Africa and explores the psychology behind these offenders. But more importantly, we get some tips on how we can prevent such crimes from going forward. Welcome to The Laughter, Nadya.
Hi, good afternoon.
Now, I couldn't think of a better time to have you in studio because this is currently what our country is facing, and we are mourning the passings of such incredible women. Of course, when you break it down for yourself, we want to understand the perspective and the psychology behind these perpetrators. How can we kind of grasp what goes on in their minds?
Okay, well, I think firstly we need to be very careful about generalizing because we're talking about a variety of different contexts, the different types of attacks, whether we're talking about rape, whether we're talking about femicide, sometimes both, whether we're talking about domestic violence. So I want to be very cautious when it comes to giving a profile or describing a typical perpetrator. There are perpetrators who absolutely would qualify as a psychopath, in other words, who would be considered to have a clear personality disorder, and others not. For example, the Medical Research Council produced a report, a study looking at men in KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. I think it was a large sample, perhaps 1,600 participants. 25% of those men admitted to having raped someone. So we are not saying that 25% of our population are psychopaths. We understand that on average between 1 to 4% of any population might qualify as being a psychopath. So that's very little. How do we account for the 21 to 24% of those men who committed that sexual violence?
So, Nadya, you mentioned that there are different types of perpetrators, and of course they have different impetus, different reasons why they do attack and why they do abuse. Can you walk me through those different steps and stages of abuse?
Well, I think before we start focusing on the individual and on the here and now, we need to locate this in a particular context. Sadly, in South Africa, we know all too well that we have a horrendous history going back many hundreds of years of brutality, of slavery, of apartheid, and this provides a bit of a context for these things to be happening. So for generations, there's been a habituation around violence. Violence has become normalized in all its various permutations.
Absolutely.
Violence has become a language, it's become a way of solving problems, it's become a communication of all kinds of things. So bearing in mind this context of violence that is normalized, then we can think a little bit about what is happening with these particular incidences, with these particular attacks, particularly the ones that have come to the attention of the media and South Africa in general recently. So it is possible that some of them, and I have read a little bit about some of the cases, that given the information that we have, that some of those individuals and perpetrators might qualify for being a psychopath. So what is a psychopath?
Yes.
Well, it's a term we use to describe a particular personality disorder. A personality disorder is not something transient. It's not like a depressive episode that someone will pass through. A personality disorder is a very worrying way of being a persistent, enduring pattern of relating to the self and to other people. And it affects people's thinking, their perceptions, it affects the way and their capacity to feel, it affects their interpersonal relationships. And with a psychopath, their cognitions and their perceptions are very much grandiose, they're self-referential. It's very much about what can I get out of the situation. What characterizes psychopaths is that they tend to be incredibly callous and unemotional.
Yes.
They lack a capacity for remorse and for empathy.
Do you think that these triggers might be environmental, or do you think that this is just biological and a person is born a psychopath?
Okay, well, this is a controversial question, and many people are asking this and looking into that. It is never one thing, and we need to be incredibly careful about trying to attribute one thing to making sense of what's going on. So biology, no. Context, yes. Biology, and what we see is individuals who are identified as psychopaths, their brain operates in a slightly different way. We notice that their prefrontal cortex and their amygdala are not operating and not as active as other people. So what is the prefrontal cortex?
Yes.
It's this part of the brain. It is what characterizes us as human beings. It's the more evolved aspect of our brain, which is responsible for things like decision-making, problem-solving, moderating social behavior, conflict resolution. And that we see is less active in psychopaths than in other individuals. Whether that causes or is a consequence of other experiences, we can't exactly say.
Absolutely.
But we know that there are certainly all kinds of differences in the way that psychopaths operate and the way that they relate to people.
And I'm sure that these characteristics differ from person to person. Of course, one blanket does not, of course, dress the entire group. But what can people look out for? What are the warning signs? A lot of times you hear that this is someone that people knew. The abuser is someone, it's a family member, it's a friend, or it's a colleague. Very seldomly do we hear that it was a random stranger who came and attacked. So what are some of the identifiers, and how do we know who's safe?
Okay. Well, to answer the last question, how do we know who's safe? Well, this is the thing, we don't. We can be doing something as innocuous as going to the post office, assuming that that is a safe thing to do, and it is not. So, well, the identifying factors, we need to be, again, very careful about that. You can't identify a psychopath. I think what happens is that, in my experience working with adults and young, well, teenagers who are kind of showing signs of psychopathy, there's a very visceral response. You feel that that person, they have a shallow emotions. They, there's something quite uncomfortable that you feel something is not quite right.
And not genuine or authentic about that person.
Yeah, they can be incredibly charming and they can be very tuned into what it is that they think you want to hear. But there's something that feels like it is lacking. There's something a little bit vacant. Their lack of concern, their lack of empathy is also something that you might pick up on. But I think we need to be cautious about trying to identify and witch hunt this person is a psychopath.
I think it's just the need or want for answers, and that's why it's so quick and easy for a person to be like, okay, let's analyze and scope everyone around my children, everyone around our space to kind of keep it safe. But I definitely do hear you loud and clear. And lastly, I want to find out, what initiatives, what do we need to do to ensure that this doesn't happen, whether it is with the justice system, do we incorporate the death penalty, or are there different ways in which we treat the different abusers?
Okay. So, well, just to come on to the death penalty, and I was at the protest on Thursday and people were calling out and wanting, you know, they want action, they want something concrete, a very clear consequence. And perhaps for the survivors of the family of the victim, that might feel like a satisfying outcome. But we know from studies that introducing the death penalty does not reduce homicide or femicide or gender-based violence. We know actually from studies that in the USA, for example, when they, in the 50s, reviewed the legislation around death penalty, those states that did away with the death penalty, their homicide rates reduced over time. Those states that introduced the death penalty, their homicide rates increased over time. So we need to be very careful that we mustn't just want that kind of eye for an eye, you've done this, we need to do that as retribution, because the long-term consequence is not a positive one.
Well, we definitely look forward to continuing this much-needed conversation here on Afternoon Express, and do not go anywhere because we'd love to have you throughout the show, of course, giving your incredible wisdom. Thank you so much, Nadya.
Thank you.
Now, after the break, we meet the amazing women of the ICU organization.